Hello. Apparently we are live. Not 100. Oh, we're not doing. Let's go. Okay. We are apparently live. Hello and welcome to live programming here at the More Freedom Foundation. Please let me know in the chat if this is not coming through for some reason. What we're going to be discussing today is the extraordinary sort of revolution in diplomatic affairs that Turkey is experiencing. Over the past week, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has met with the Israeli president, the Greek prime minister, and the German chancellor. All of these folks coming to Ankara, coming to meet Erdogan on his home turf. This is a tremendously significant development, and it's a huge shift from the way that Erdogan and Turkey had been viewed in sort of worldwide diplomacy, NATO diplomacy, the West, whatever, over the past 5 or 6 years. This is a tremendous shift. Today we're going to be talking about that shift, why it's come about. Obviously it's come about due to Russia and Ukraine, but we'll talk about that. We'll talk about how Turkey may or may not be maximizing this opportunity that it has. And yeah, I think we've got interesting presentation for you today. For those of you who may be new here, what we do is a presentation that I've put together. We'll do that for the next half hour, 45 minutes or so. And then after that, for the duration of the call, for 2 hours or so, for 2 hours total, for an additional hour or so after the presentation, I will do Q&A. If you want to do super chats, I would ask that you please hold off until then. I can't engage with the chat as I'm doing my presentation, as I'm, I think, already demonstrating. I don't have a ton of mental bandwidth while I'm doing the presentation. There is a chat. You are encouraged to participate in the chat. You're encouraged to say anything you want about me, about the ideas that I'm expressing. Usually, most anything, we're pretty open-minded as to what you want to say about the conflict. We'd ask that you please avoid any kind of genocidal statements about an ongoing war. But beyond that, you can say pretty much anything you want, ask anything you want, say anything you want about me or my ideas. What we do ask, and in fact what we require, is that you be civil to each other within the chat. We have our moderator, Logo Cool Extreme, who has been deputized to moderate this chat. What Loga says goes. If you find that, if he finds that you're doing something disruptive, if you're either disrupting the chat or insulting or trying to gang up on somebody else in the chat, Loga will warn you, and if you ignore him, he will block you. There is no appeal from the court of Loga, so listen to what he says. All that said, let's get into it. Obviously, the reason Turkey is experiencing a massive shift in its diplomatic fortunes is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Let's take a look at this broader map here that explains why, in fact, Turkey is so important to ongoing operations. I saw some rumors on Twitter today that Russia might be in fact about to engage in its long-threatened attack on Odessa from the Black Sea. That's amphibious. I've also seen a lot of skepticism about whether that's going to happen. I share that skepticism. But regardless, the Black Sea is a tremendously important aspect of what's going on with this conflict, and Turkey controls that. That is, of course, the most obvious and most important way in which Turkey can have an impact on this conflict. Mariupol is probably the most brutalized city in the Russia-Ukraine conflict at this point. Russia's activities around Mariupol are supported by naval resources within the Black Sea. Though it seems likely that Russia already positioned all of the resources it needed in the Black Sea. Turkey's control of the Bosphorus Strait that goes directly through Istanbul, Turkey's control of that territory could have an impact if this conflict drags on for further weeks or months. Could have a huge impact. And beyond that, the simple factor of Turkey's size is tremendously important. Turkey is a top 20 economy. I've gotten some pushback when I've described the Turkish military as the second largest military in NATO. Perhaps there's some disputes in terms of naval assets or air assets that perhaps France or the United Kingdom has some kind of edge. Frankly, I doubt it. But in terms of sheer manpower, I don't think there's any question that Turkey has the largest military in NATO. NATO is now engaged in a more or less open proxy war against Russia. Turkey, all of a sudden, has gone from a diplomatic problem, a controversy, an inconvenient issue, has all of a sudden transferred into a country with a ton of resources, which is a ton of resources that are valuable for conflict. Turkey's flirtation with Russia over the past 5 or 6 years, flirtation/conflict, it's always been a tremendously dubious thing. Are Turkey and Russia working with each other? Are they fighting each other? As they were facing each other across at least 2 and possibly 3 major conflicts within the broader Middle East, North Africa, Caucasus region. Are they friends? Are they enemies? And of course, that relationship is another thing that has been entirely thrown out of whack by these developments. But there's a really crucial question here that I don't think Turkey has quite appreciated the continued significance of. For European countries, for Greece, for Germany, folks that are much more concerned with the threat of Russia directly in their face, it seems as though the diplomatic rapprochement or rejuvenation has happened. I mean, having a German chancellor go and visit, I'm sure Merkel at some point visited Erdogan in Turkey, but I have a sense that she hadn't done so for at least half a decade. I could be incorrect about that, but regardless, the significance of meeting with the Greek prime minister the day before meeting with the German chancellor on Erdogan's home turf. It's clear that Europe is very interested in taking this conflict very seriously as its highest priority, and is willing to do what is necessary to grin and bear it and shake hands with Erdogan if it's necessary to do so. What is not clear, what has not yet been established, is that the United States is willing to do so. And towards the end of this presentation, I'll talk about the 2 main barriers between the United States welcoming Turkey and not welcoming Turkey, sort of back into the fold, diplomatically speaking. Of course, Turkey has always officially been part of the U.S. Western European bloc in NATO. Its participation in a wide variety of trade flows, etc., has very minorly been interrupted, even though there have been actual official sanctions. That might be a good way to start, is to sort of talk about the extent to which Turkey has actually been isolated over the past 5 or 6 years. The isolation that Turkey has experienced is a pretty strong diplomatic freezing out. Erdogan, specifically, the personality of the president of Turkey, has become unacceptable to Europe and the United States in a variety of reasons, for a variety of reasons. But the way that this relationship has worked is actually similar to the way that the Turkish-Israeli relationship has worked. For a decade now, Turkey has made waves, made himself unpopular in the United States, but made himself very popular in the Middle East by being willing to call out Israeli prime ministers, Israeli governments, over their treatment of the Palestinians, especially in the aftermath of the Mavi Marmara incident. Was it 2010 or 2011, where the Israeli military killed a bunch of Turkish activists who were attempting to get humanitarian stuff to Gaza. In the aftermath of that, Turkey and Israel, they actually didn't have diplomatic relations for 5 years. Those were reconnected in 2016. But even during the period when Turkey and Israel officially did not have diplomatic relations, trade continued, participation continued. There was never a point at which you couldn't fly from Istanbul to Tel Aviv. It was sort of more of a show. And I think that those diplomatic shows, that diplomatic unpleasantness, of course, over time wears away at the connections between countries and wears away at the possibility of new projects, new business, new opportunities. That gets worn away at by these sort of diplomatic kerfluffles. But the bones of the Turkish relationship with the United States, Europe, were maintained, but with more and more fragility, more and more problems, basically. And I think the most sort of scorching example of that would be the sanctions that were initiated against Turkey in December 2020. It's important, of course, to keep in mind that these sanctions, though they could absolutely, countering America's adversaries through Sanctions Act, these sanctions were initiated because of Turkey's purchase of the S-400 surface-to-air defense system from Russia. And these sanctions are incredibly minor. They're mostly, if you look at the details as I put up on screen, a prohibition on granting specific U.S. export licenses and authorizations for any goods or technology, a prohibition on loans or credits by U.S. financial institutions totaling more than $10 million in a 12-month period, a ban on U.S. export-import assistance, a requirement for the United States to oppose loans benefiting the SSB by international financial institutions. So in terms of like sanctions tools that the United States avails itself of, these sanctions against Turkey were tiny. They were minor. They essentially acted as a bar on further actions, further cooperation between certain aspects of the U.S. and Turkish military-industrial complexes. There's some very real implications of that related to F-35s and F-16s, but they were quite light and mostly intended as a clarifying insult to make it clear to Turkey just how seriously the United States took these problems. But I think in 2020 and in 2021, we had a situation where it seemed likely that these sanctions that were sort of informal, were somewhat minor, were the start of something, potentially the start of something much worse, something that a break between the U.S. and Turkey that was sort of just slowly distancing, but there was a momentum building where it could get further and further and further and become more and more of a problem. Russia's invasion of Ukraine seems to have stopped that aspect. Turkey's relationship with Europe and with the United States, media complex more broadly, is of course fraught for a wider variety of issues. It's important to note, however, that the actual formal relationship between the United States and Turkey was never really truly damaged until this S-400 purchase in 2019, the purchase by the Turkish military of a Russian air defense system. But from the Gezi uprising in 2013, human rights concerns about the Turkish government, personal antipathy to the president, Erdogan, that was all growing. That was becoming more and more of a factor. Turkey, thanks to the Syrian civil war, which I think has done a tremendous amount to destabilize Turkey and the Turkish government over the past decade, Turkey had Erdogan, when he was prime minister and then later as president of Turkey, had a lot of leeway to be quite insulting, undiplomatic, and bruising to the United States and Europe. In the first half of the Syrian civil war, the United States had tremendous interest in working with Turkey to unseat Assad, to open up a massive open area in northern Syria for jihadists. When, to the surprise and horror of the United States, one of those proxy jihadist groups we had set up turned out to be the Islamic State, shocked. We changed our policy quite dramatically, and Turkey became less useful to us. And I think that break became more and more apparent in 2016 and 2017 when we started working much more closely with Kurdish groups in Syria that are closely affiliated with a terrorist group that Turkey is very much opposed to. The same dynamic was present in Turkey's relationship with Europe. Initially, or at least in 2014, 2015, 2016, Erdogan essentially could write his own ticket with Europe, could basically tell them what to do, or at least what was or was not acceptable, because Turkey had his hand, the Turkish leader Erdogan had his hand on the spigot of refugees, the refugee crisis that was tearing Europe apart. Of course, Turkey personally took 3 times as many refugees as Europe, the entire continent, did. Implying obviously that Turkey is a much more serious country in a range of ways than any European country, but I guess that's a different discussion. But regardless, the tiny amount of refugees compared to places like Turkey or Lebanon were taking was really just roiling European politics, probably led to Brexit. And at that point, Erdogan essentially had Europe over a barrel. That faded. The Russian intervention essentially ended the war in Syria. Refugee flows slowed down. Europe made it a lot more clear just how unwelcoming it was to refugees. So that weapon faded. Turkey, over the past 5 years, really throughout the Trump administration, had sort of proven itself to be a lot less useful to the United States and Europe than it had been at the height of the destruction of the Syrian civil war. Useful to the United States because the United States was working closely with Turkey to create that destruction, and useful to Europe because Turkey had control over the flow of refugees. And yeah, as the war faded, Erdogan had sort of set out all these very controversial, angry, and insulting positions. Again, I think he called the Germans Nazis multiple times, was very strenuous in his opposition to Israeli actions, which the United States never likes. Basically was acting as a bully, and a quite childish bully, and to the extreme detriment of Turkey's position. I think Turkey has, to this date, believe that Turkey has an extraordinarily important grievance, a rational grievance against the United States for getting in bed with a terrorist organization that tried to destroy Turkey. But because of the way that Erdogan had always expressed those concerns, deeply insulting. Some of this is translation. I mean, Erdogan is one of the few serious heads of state, on the world stage who simply doesn't speak English. The way that, he communicated that was very successful with the Turkish public was not successful with the diplomatic community more broadly. But also, I think even by the standards of, the Qasim Pasha rabble rouser that Erdogan is, I think even he has to know that he stepped way too far. And then as the Syrian civil war became less important, there just was less leeway for Erdogan's bullshit. So that was the situation that we were in early February of 2022, a month ago, essentially. That was the situation we were in. Russia's insane invasion, insane handicapping of itself by invading Ukraine, and the destruction that has wrought on European peace more generally, and Russia's status everywhere, has brought about a diplomatic revolution for Turkey. We're already seeing, I think, perhaps I do this a little too much, but I think one of the best ways to look at this is in the context of the Syrian conflict. The last real flare-up of fighting, and it was a very serious flare-up of fighting. Happened, I believe, in February and March of 2020. The Syrian military had been cutting down the Idlib pocket, the last rebel enclave within Syria in Idlib, and had decided, I don't know if they did this consciously as an attempt to push its luck or just by mistake, but the Syrian army then ended up bombing a camp full of Turkish observers or what have you, killing dozens of Turkish soldiers. Turkey's response was quite quick and quite convincing, basically rolling back. I think the Syrian Arab Army, the Assad government had spent 3 to 6 months making gains in the Idlib pocket. The aroused and infuriated Turkish military wiped away a third to two-thirds of those gains in a 72-hour period. There was a brief moment of great excitement in Washington, D.C. Oh gosh, is Turkey going to finally take Assad out for us? And that rampage ended when Vladimir Putin called up Erdogan and simply told him not to. And I think there's two aspects of the Syrian conflict that have changed dramatically. I've always thought that the U.S.'s policy towards Turkey in Syria has been insane. Turkey is a top 20 economy, huge NATO treaty partner of half a century's standing, and the U.S. Choosing to abandon and insult Turkey by pairing up with a bunch of Kurdish militias, affiliated with organizations dedicated to the dividing up of Turkish territory, always struck me as insane and insulting and stupid. And if there had been any prime minister or president of Turkey who wasn't already an international pariah the way Erdogan was, then I think there would have been a more honest discussion of what a bad idea that was. We needed someone, the amount of times people do, we needed somebody to fight against the Islamic State and Turkey wasn't doing it. It's like, well, yeah, but the Islamic State was an out-of-control U.S. proxy. So it's the idea that we need to throw over one of our most important regional alliances of half a century standing because we weren't dealing with one of our out-of-control proxies as quickly as we wanted to. Doesn't strike me as a justifiable excuse. I think that estimation of the sort of Turkey versus the SDF, the sort of official name for the Syrian Kurds, that dynamic has shifted dramatically over the past 2 weeks. The Kurds, previously so useful for us in this smacking around, this out-of-control proxy, the Islamic State, essentially provide us nothing in a broader conflict with Russia and Ukraine, while Turkey has the potential to provide us with everything. The most important thing would be, of course, debatably the most important thing that Turkey provides is the Bosphorus Strait. It is, as I pointed out earlier, the Bosphorus is the way into the Black Sea, a theater of military operations in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. This is not immediately important. As I said, I believe the necessary Russian assets were already put into the Black Sea. But as this conflict wears on, that will become more and more important, especially if Russia opts to do this naval attack on Odessa. The chances of Russia losing ships that might need to be replaced, the chances of Russia needing to resupply those ships in some way. Though I think obviously it's more likely that Russia would be able to resupply those ships from Crimea and the Russian mainland. Who knows? What other assets had Russia had all over the world that it might want to bring in to this conflict between Russia and Ukraine over Odessa. So I think as time wears on, this will become more and more important. It's the Montreux Convention of 1936 is what allows, was essentially a revision of the Treaty of Lausanne in the 1920s that gave Turkey more power over the Bosphorus than that earlier treaty had done. And it gives, I believe, under Article 19, I haven't looked into this myself, I'm just reading other people's glosses on this, but I believe that Article 19 allows Turkey to block the straits in a time of war. Of course, Article 19 also provides exceptions to that Turkey can use, but it is significant that Turkey has already invoked Article 19, has declared that Russia and Ukraine are in a state of war. So if Russia attempts to use that either to bring assets back to the Black Sea or to bring assets from Russia down to Syria, on the other side of Turkey, on the other side, in the Mediterranean, then that becomes tremendously more difficult. As time wears on, who knows? Perhaps we'll be in a position 3 to 6 months from now when Russia needs to use the strait, and we'll say that if Turkey doesn't allow us to use the strait, we will cut off all gas supplies to Turkey. That's a possibility. I think nobody should assume that just because this step has been taken by Turkey, that it's a permanent step, that there won't be exceptions, that it won't have any, that it automatically means Russia has no access to the Bosphorus anymore. I think but it is an important thing that in the days of the conflict, the early days of the conflict, Turkey had already invoked the Montreux Convention, declaring the conflict between Russia and Ukraine to be in wartime. So this is a tremendously important thing that Turkey has. The Syrian Democratic Forces, the Syrian Kurds, don't have control of a major strait that leads into the theater of war between Russia and Ukraine. That's something they don't have. Another really key thing, something that I was skeptical of prior to this conflict, that I think I've been wrong, I've been corrected, almost as bad as my expectation that tanks wouldn't be a significant part of this conflict. The Turkish Bayraktar drones have been a key part of Ukraine's defense. I saw somewhere, this was in the first week of the conflict, so it's impossible to say, and it was only ever just an estimate at that point as well, but there are estimates that like 10% of the material that Russia has been lost to Bayraktar drones. That's, who knows if that's true, but regardless, it's been a tremendous contribution to Ukraine's fight. And Turkey is committed to continuing, I don't know if it's more sales or donations, it's probably more sales, continuing deliveries of these Bayraktars during the ongoing conflict. In the first week of the conflict, Turkey resupplied, I think, possibly new Bayraktar airframes, but certainly more munitions for those Bayraktars. So Turkey has demonstrated, again, the SDF, the Syrian Kurds, do not have, in fact, a independent drone arsenal and are not capable of supplying the Ukrainians with such drones. So Turkey's also providing humanitarian aid. Turkey, importantly, has not joined in on any sanctions against Russia, which is not particularly surprising. The main thing that Turkey depends on Russia for is gas. So it's in the company of Germany, another country that has not sanctioned their most important economic input from Russia as of yet. So that is not particularly surprising. Turkey is still, to an extent, attempting to maintain something like ambivalence or what's the word I'm looking for here? Like some kind of balance and continuing to make claims of friendship towards Russia. But it's fascinating. This is sort of a flip side of the arguments a lot of people in Washington, D.C. were making. It's sort of, to be clear, I never agreed with this argument, but you'd hear a lot of people who didn't know much about the Middle East, saying, why is Turkey our ally in NATO again? Turkey should be kicked out of NATO because they're not helping us, fight this out-of-control proxy we set up with them. Just basically deeply ignorant statement. But, there are aspects, if you don't know much about geopolitics or how the world works, there are aspects of that I could see were attractive. Like, oh, well, he's an authoritarian, as if we don't ally with authoritarians, or, oh, he's got humanitarian issues, as if we don't have humanitarian issues. But then specifically, he's not helping us with the Islamic State. He's more interested in fighting the terrorist group that wants to destroy his country than he is the proxies that we got him to support in the first place. But like this idea that, he wants to be friendly with us, he wants to be in an alliance with us, but he doesn't really help us with anything. That's now switched entirely. I think it's very clear, even to the United States, that is not yet as willing to fully engage with Erdogan as Europe has been. Even in the United States, it's pretty damn clear that we're getting a lot out of this Turkish relationship. And in Moscow, they've got to be like, the fuck? Like, he's trying to talk about how, Turkey's friendly with us, but he's arming the Ukrainians, he's threatening us, our use of the Bosphorus, he's providing humanitarian goods. So it's interesting how Erdogan's sort of balancing act of like, I'm a Western ally, but I'm pissing off a lot of people in the West, has now switched to, I'm friendly to Russia. But he's working directly against Russia's agenda in Ukraine. So that is a very interesting shift. Obviously, just a quick point, it is tremendously in the interests of the United States and Europe to get Turkey further on side. I think Turkey's sort of if we can't get Turkey on our side, then how the hell are we going to get India or the 54 African countries? I think if you look at the UN General Assembly resolution condemning Russia, I mean, most abstained. Most folks in Latin America, most folks in Africa, or at least well over half of Africa abstained. It was only not exclusively, but it was mostly more transparent U.S. clients that voted against Russia in the UN General Assembly resolution. So if we can't keep Turkey on side here, then we're never going to get India on our side. We're never going to get African countries on our side. We're never going to get Latin American countries on our side against Russia. So I think it is tremendously important, and we've seen a recognition of that from Europe. We have not seen such a recognition of that from the United States as of yet. So that flip in Syria, the Kurds, before February 24th, 2022, the Kurds were our valiant allies against the Islamic State. Now Turkey is potentially a linchpin of our proxy war against Russia, and tremendously more important. This is something that I didn't think it would happen this way or this quickly, but it was always clear to me that Turkey was a tremendously valuable ally against Russia, and I think now that's clearer to a whole bunch of other people. There's that flip between all of a sudden the Turks are a much more valuable ally than the Kurds, but there's also a flip in the way that Russia and Turkey interact in Syria. In March of 2020, I had mentioned Turkey, the Assad's government was dumb enough to kill a bunch of Turkish soldiers, and the Turkish army was like, okay, fine, you want this? Here, come and get it, and basically just rampaged through the Syrian Arab army until Russia told them to stop. So my understanding of the Russian conflict, and I think a lot of the Syrian conflict, and I think a lot of other folks, was that understanding, this may not be entirely accurate, but I do think the shift is accurate. It's a question of degree. My sense was that Turkey was operating in Syria sort of with Russian permission and under Russian sufferance. The Russians allowed Turkey to take territory in Syria, negotiated between themselves. I mean, obviously, Russia's sort of Syrian client didn't want Turkey to take any territory, but it was sort of part of Russia's great power game, sort of back and forth. Turkey allowing Turkey to take territory, but there was only to a certain point. And, because of course Turkey wasn't taking territory from the Syrian government, he was taking it from the Kurds or the Islamic State. So yeah, Russia, basically Turkey operated in Syria with, to some degree, Russian permission. And I'd always seen Russia as a much more serious military than it has proved to be. Russia is a military that had guided munitions, has guided munitions, has high-tech stuff, but in very, very limited amounts. It's mostly a 20th century army. And in Syria, where a number of assets were used, I think 30 planes at the highest, certainly lots and lots and lots and lots of missiles and lots of sorties over 5 years, but a very few, small number of the best maintained and highest tech stuff they had in Syria. My assumption, I think a lot of other people had assumed that that Russia had those capabilities and was capable of using those capabilities on more of a mass front. Ukraine not only has tied down a massive amount of Russian military resources, it has also made it very clear that Russia does not have higher tech munitions and equipment to use at scale. So that sense that, Turkey operates in Syria, with Russia's permission, has entirely flipped to, I think, an assumption that Russia operates in Syria with Turkey's permission, which is interesting because that actually might fray the coalition in Syria a little bit, because Turkey has experienced Syria chaos to some degree. So Turkey was obviously very strongly opposed to Assad in the beginning. I think there's been some, lessening of that. But if it comes to a point where Russia looks flimsy in Syria, Washington, D.C., the United States is going to get very excited about, oh, good, we can finally kill off Assad. Whereas Turkey would be like, oh, wait a second, I don't like, I prefer the Islamic State to the Kurds, but that doesn't mean I want the Islamic State to run Syria. And I think that it might be interesting to see if Turkey, as Russia sort of falls out of Syria, which hasn't happened yet, but becomes very possible as the conflict in Ukraine wears on for weeks or months, or God forbid years, Turkey might get more interested in being friends with Assad, but that's a whole nother question, I think the key thing to keep in mind is this shift that, before February of this year, it looked like Turkey operated in Syria with Russian permission, but now it looks a lot more like Russia operates in Syria with Turkish permission. And that's another aspect that, of course, makes the Turkish relationship more powerful to the United States. What are the main problems here for Turkish reemergence? And the main problem with the United States specifically is the S-400. The S-400, the Russian air defense system that Turkey purchased from Russia. The S-400 specifically, folks point out that I believe the Greeks have the S-300 missile defense system, the last generation. The thing is that in this current, and I actually believe this. I don't think this is bullshit. I don't have any deep expertise, but this does seem plausible to me. The S-400 is meant to operate in the same modern 21st century military realm that the F-35 is meant to operate in. Information warfare is tremendously important. Shielding and protecting the networked warfare of the F-35 is tremendously important. And the S-400, presumably has sensors or technologies that its placement in an environment or its incorporation into the air defense systems of a country that operates F-35s the newest, flashiest, most impressive sort of fighter option that the United States has, would potentially compromise the ability to use the F-35. I believe that. I think that's plausible to me. Obviously, I have no deep expertise here, but that actually makes sense to me. So what the S-400 purchase did, and I think Erdogan, I think the Turkish government, to the extent that folks other than Erdogan and the Turkish government were making this decision, thought that we'll buy this S-400, and it's a good bargaining chip. It's a good, like the sanctions against Turkey, it's a good sign to the United States how angry we are. And of course, on the field of like basic justice or turning back and forth, the Turkey purchasing a Russian air defense system is nowhere near as insulting or existentially threatening as the United States essentially allying with a terrorist group that is or an affiliate of a terrorist group that is against the continued existence of Turkey. It's nowhere near as bad as what the United States did, but we're dealing in international relations. We're dealing in geopolitics, and that does not matter. The United States remains the 800-pound gorilla. And I don't think Turkey or Erdogan appreciated just how insulting and damaging the S-400 purchase was to the U.S. relationship. I don't think Turkey really quite appreciated how little the United States really gives a shit. Even now, with Russia and Ukraine, how little the U.S. government really gives a shit about anything that happens in the world other than their ability to sell weapons. The U.S. government is heavily invested in Ukraine's fight against Russia and all rah-rah and excited about it because it allows us to sell F-35s, this next-generation fighter jet, to everybody. I believe in the past 48 hours, Germany has now committed to a large F-35 order. Finland is giving us $10 billion for F-35s. As I pointed out in the past, the reason we focus so much on the Russia fight in the United States over the much more threatening China fight is because there's simply more people to sell weapons to in Europe. In Asia, we've got Japan, we've got South Korea. We have Japan and South Korea. We approved Vietnam to purchase more U.S. weapons, but they haven't yet. India buys its weapons from Russia still. Whereas in Europe, everybody, even these tiny countries are very wealthy and can afford. Finland bought $10 billion worth of F-35s. So we care a lot about selling weapons. It's arguably the main thing we care about. And what we really, really don't like is somebody leaving our weapons procurement parade. And Turkey was someone that was committed to buy at the outset, and I think manufactured some components or was going to manufacture many components of the F-35, and was one of the initial signatories, back when we called it the Joint Strike Fighter back in, 20 years ago. Turkey was in this F-35 complex, and purchasing a piece of equipment that takes them out of U.S. defense procurement is the greatest break with the United States imaginable. Despite the United States working very, very hard to put India into its Quad structure to oppose China, despite the United States going so far as to tear up the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty under George W. Bush in 2007 or 8, and allow India to have nuclear weapons just so we have a better ally against China. Despite all of that, there's a serious movement in Washington, D.C. to sanction India for owning Russian weapons, as it has for 75 years. That's how seriously we take. So if we're willing to throw over our biggest and most important ally, we haven't yet, but we're contemplating it. If we're willing to do that in our biggest potential ally against our biggest potential rival over defense procurement, obviously we're willing to throw over Turkey. Europe, no, I think Europe is very serious about getting back into bed with Turkey now because they see it as a real fight, a real existential fight. The United States sees Russia and Ukraine as a real opportunity to sell more weapons. If Turkey gets in the way of that, and if Turkey isn't going to be giving us those new contracts for F-35s, because presumably having the S-400 also means that Turkey can't buy our high-end ships. Turkey can't buy our high-end systems of everything going forward. Tellingly, so when they purchased this system in 2019, I think Turkey was almost immediately kicked out of the F-35 program. The CAATSA sanctions were introduced in the fall of 2020, and now, because Turkey can't get the F-35, they want to renovate their F-16s and buy some new ones. This is another U.S. Classic U.S. weapon fighter jet. And that has been on hold. The Congressional Research Service report that I read in preparation for this suggested that perhaps that might be allowed to go forward. But, you know, I'd honestly be surprised. Like, the S-400 is this incredible stumbling block to the Turkish ability to get back in the U.S.'s good graces. And while it's very important and worthwhile that Turkey seems to be able to be rejuvenating its diplomacy with Israel, with Greece, with Germany, with Europe, it's the United States that still makes decisions in Syria. It's the United States that is still in charge of NATO. It's the United States that all of these European actors who might be more willing to work with Erdogan now, it's all these European actors defer to the United States. So this S-400 is just something that Turkey has to get rid of. I think it's really that straightforward. And if they do get rid of it, I think they will find that that Washington, D.C. will all of a sudden be super eager to celebrate Turkey again. That is the huge stumbling block. Yeah, if Turkey doesn't move on that, I think they're going to be surprised how little they end up getting out of this incredible Russia-Ukraine opportunity in the long term. Another stumbling block is worth pointing out, and I think this is the closing thing. Wow, James, that's quite a question. I'll get to that super chat, but yeah, I think let me close here talking about Erdogan. The other incredible stumbling block, not as big as the S-400, nowhere but near as big as the S-400, is the personality of Erdogan himself. As this, you know, what if this crisis resolves quickly? It doesn't seem likely, but it's entirely possible that 2 weeks from now, Russia and Ukraine could have some kind of deal, and Russia would be withdrawing. And then Turkey's opportunity will be over. And at that point, the extreme antipathy that Erdogan has managed to build up everywhere in the world against him, his style, his personality will come roaring back. Erdogan remains an incredible stumbling block. And I think that everyone in the world is very conscious of the fact that Erdogan faces elections in 2023. And I think if the Russian-Ukraine crisis were to fall in significance, threat, and salience, if that were to fall in significance and salience, then I think everyone will start thinking a little bit harder about, oh, do we really want to welcome Turkey back in? Well, you know, this clown's still in charge, and it's going to help him. Do we want to help him in these upcoming elections? And then, of course, that's the one crucial dynamic that I want to close with. Of course, if Turkey successfully, as it seems to be doing with Europe thus far, manages to get itself back into the good graces of the West, potentially involving more investment, more defense cooperation, more everything, doesn't that help Recep Tayyip Erdogan, this character that many in Turkey and abroad would rather be done with? And that's a pretty large concern. I think if Erdogan dropped the S-500, the S-400, then very quickly he would find that it didn't really matter whether he was there. Yeah, it's almost like if the opposition wants to, well, no, that goes a little too far. Yeah, it's I think holding on to the S-400 actually makes Erdogan less likely to profit. So maybe we should encourage him to hold on to it. I don't know. Regardless, those are the two big barriers to Turkey's re-engagement with its Western allies, the S-400 and Erdogan. I would see S-400 as a much bigger part of that. Okay, so that is... I saw somebody say that Turkey first tried to buy Patriots, if I recall correctly. Yes, the big issue was that we would let him buy Patriots, would let Turkey buy Patriots. The big issue was that we didn't give Turkey the level of technology transfer or participation in the Patriots that they wanted. So Erdogan, this is part of those negotiations, like, oh, well, I'll go to Russia. And Russia absolutely did not give Turkey any kind of technology transfer or participation in the S-400 purchase. So yeah, that Patriot thing is a bit of a canard. What is a canard? I don't know what a canard is. I just said that. I always hate it when I don't know what my words are. I feel like that happens more and more. Like I can already feel my brain ossifying in my 40s, and I less and less. I understand less and less of the words I use. That's less and less, not fewer and fewer, because it's not that I understand fewer of the words. I understand less of the individual word that I understand. Anyway, whatever. James R23 asks, thank you for the super chat. As it has been provided in the super chat, I feel obligated to be more polite to this question than I would otherwise. But why isn't the U.S. sanctioning Mexico after their declared support of Russia? Is our southern border at risk? It is fascinating just watching, and unfortunately successfully, watching a lot of folks in Washington, D.C. who profit off of made-up problems like the U.S. border, able to see, I was momentarily optimistic in the first weeks of this conflict that the United States was going to finally make headway on peace with Venezuela, on peace with Iran, just for simple oil market requirements and survival. But it seems like folks like James R23, with short-sighted, delusional views of how the world works, are winning the argument in Washington, D.C. And this is, thank you, James, this is exactly the kind of argument. Why is U.S. sanctioning Mexico after their declared support of Russia? Is our southern border at risk? It's very little. This is exactly the sort of standard argument that you see in Washington, D.C. and on Fox News and CNN and MSNBC, that and no element of it actually makes sense. What Mexico has refused to do is join in on sanctioning and condemnation of Ukraine because of the history of the Mexican Revolution, where the United States intervened to make it dramatically worse. It's interesting because throughout the 20th century, there's this really dark history of the United States intervening throughout South America. But I almost feel like we got so burned by our collusion and the murder of Francisco Madero in the opening years of the Mexican Revolution. We murdered this guy who we didn't really like, who was honestly like a pretty standard, boring, liberal revolutionary guy who was just like, Mexico shouldn't be a de facto economic slave to the United States. And we're like, oh, you can't say that. So we helped, was it Huerta or someone else? We helped Huerta kill him. And then, of course, in the ensuing 9 years, the Mexican Revolution went like full on, like in some aspects, socialist or communist, or just went very, very far left, got much, much worse, included Pancho Villa invading the United States and I think sacking a U.S. town. So I think the United States learned what we didn't learn in the rest of South America, but we learned that with Mexico, maybe we should just let them do their thing a little bit. Because of this experience that Mexico had, not just U.S. intervention during the Revolution, but French intervention during the U.S. Civil War when we weren't paying attention, Mexico has always had a pretty strong policy of just staying out, just not getting involved. And what James is referring to, declared support of Russia. No, they're simply saying we're not going to get involved in this. We're not going to get involved in UN condemnations. We're not, and honestly, I think Mexico's, as much as I dislike AMLO, I think AMLO is truly the Mexican Trump. Really just utterly, supposedly more left-leaning populist than Trump was a right-leaning populist, but they are united in their complete incapacity. Just really not particularly, just people who don't know how to govern. And the opportunities that AMLO is leaving on the table in this day and age are really quite stunning. So no affection for the current Mexican leadership. I think he's a chump, just like Trump. Yeah, this idea that they're, that they somehow aren't supporting, that somehow we have to sanction them because of their lack of willingness to get involved in a fight in Europe is insane. We should follow them, actually. It's too late now, but we should follow Mexico's lack of interest in trying to tell the world how to run itself. Is our southern border at risk? No, it has not been at risk. It is because of AMLO's mismanagement of COVID. I believe there has been a meaningful spike in folks attempting to migrate to the U.S. from Mexico for the first time since 2008, since the 2008 financial crisis. I mean, obviously, the way our labor market is going, if we lived in a sane country, we'd be like, yes, of course, come here, please, help us with our inflation, help us with this. But because we live in a country filled with deranged idiots, and the Republican Party has figured out that the only way they can drive votes anymore is by making grandma afraid of brown people, we still hear about the border, despite the fact that over the past 20 years, the border has gone from a largely open, fairly well-functioning place throughout the 20th century into one of the most sci-fi dystopia, over-militarized places on the planet. It's the Berlin Wall used to be the sort of cultural touchstone for dystopian, totalitarian, nightmare sci-fi visions of the world. That nightmare place now is the U.S.-Mexico border. I'd really encourage anybody who believes we somehow have an insecure border between the United States and Mexico to just cross from San Diego to Tijuana. It practically feels like you're in a spaceship. It is so insanely oversecured. The idea that somehow we have an insecure border is because people are lying to you. We have dramatically more people. We have a massive infrastructure. We have a government agency, a whole border industrial complex that we built up over the past 20 years that now depends on fear and the prejudices of the stupid to maintain its own budgets. So that's what talking about the southern borders at risk. I think James is playing along with us by asking such a provocatively ridiculous question. So thank you for that question, James. Christopher Murtaugh had a super chat. Canard is French for duck, which makes me understand its use less in this context. Thanks, as always. Yeah, I think canard is like, it's like, I think my sense of it is that it's like an argument that makes no sense, that is like, sort of like cant. It's sort of like, it's like a silly thing that's stated. I could be entirely wrong about that. But thank you, Christopher Murtaugh, for you don't have a question? That's a very generous super chat for simply to talk about the definition of canard. Let's see, questions. Dexton Min, hey Rob, do you think we will see a real push to get off the dollar now that the world has seen how quick the U.S. was to weaponize it against Russia? I think that's a really good question. I think it's a really interesting thing. I think we've seen a lot of people on the strength of now 3 weeks saying, oh, all of those concerns were ridiculous, or alternatively saying, oh, the dollar system is over. And I think that's a lot of people sort of extrapolating from things that they already believed. I think, and I don't think this is really appreciated, and I think I'll probably do a produced video on this next week. Turkey has an opportunity. The United States has an incredible opportunity right now. We're not the bad guy. if you listen to U.S. media, we're never the bad guy. Oh gosh, what Bush did in Iraq was really regrettable. But I think from Germany to certainly any non-white country in the world, for the past 18 years, no matter how much soft power, no matter how much real affection for the United States or real desire to move to the United States that people may have, I think it's been pretty clear since the Iraq War that the United States is full of shit and is a real problem in the world stage. Until February 24th, 2022, when Russia, there's not any real moral ambiguity here. Like, Russia pulled a poor man's George W. Bush at extraordinary cost, extraordinary brutality. It is 19th century imperial bullshit. I will never say anything for Bush's, well, not anymore, never say anything in favor of Bush's destruction of Iraq, but at least there was a fiction that, we're not taking over. We totally were trying to take over. We just failed to. Russia is openly saying this country doesn't exist. We're going to chop it up. It's Saddam Hussein stuff. It is evil. Just as evil and more transparently evil than what George W. Bush did in 2003. So the United States finally, for the first time in 2 decades, has this point where, like, our self-conception isn't that far from the world's conception. Now, we've won over Europe. We've won over Germany. What it's not clear to me that we've done, and is not clear to me that we are of any interest in doing, is winning over the rest of the world. And that's really frustrating. I think that if we followed up this incredible gift that Russia has given us by quickly making peace with Cuba and Venezuela, I think Latin America would be like, and might be more interested in hearing what we have to say about the appropriate way to treat Russia's imperialist engagement there. If we followed up this incredible gift that Russia has given us with an attempt to really, unfortunately, I would love it if we just pulled out of the Middle East, something we absolutely could do with zero negative consequences to ourselves or Israel in the next 2 weeks if we wanted. But we're not going to do that. But we could, look like the good guys in Europe for the first time in 20 years. Germany has not signed on to anything the United States has done since 2003. They have signed on wholeheartedly to the effort against Russia and Ukraine. We've got Europe. We should move on to Latin America. We should, those are really easy things to do that it looked like the Biden administration was doing before it got scared, as it always gets scared by Republicans and pieces of shit in the Democratic Party, like Bob Menendez, the most powerful senator Democratic senator on foreign policy in the Senate, probably the most powerful Democratic politician on foreign policy other than Joe Biden, is a militaristic warmongering piece of shit. But he joins with the Republican Party to keep the United States aggressive everywhere. So what we should be doing right now is to I am getting back to your question, Dexton Min. What we should be doing right now is capitalizing on this gift that Russia gave us by moving to Latin America, resolving all of that. We don't have to welcome Cuba with open arms. We can just go back to what Obama's policy towards Cuba was. Slow opening, more connections, whatever. Venezuela, rebuild their oil industry. They're happy to do it. Maduro's given up on socialism. Who cares? Let's just solve that. And then Latin America, that's all we have to do is Venezuela and Cuba, and Ortega, whatever. But and essentially, we just have it'd be so easy to have, for the first time in 20 years, we have no problems in Europe. If we just would do those, just make peace with Venezuela and Cuba, we could all of a sudden have no problems in Latin America. Then we could go to the Middle East, and obviously we're not going to be able to just pull out as we could, but we won't. And just do the JCPOA with Iran and start talking about other issues in the Middle East. This is the path forward. This is the path that allows Russia to get further isolated, allows the oil markets to stabilize, allows the United States to truly look like the good guys, to truly look like a good guy for the first time in 20 years. This is the path forward. And taking that path would make people less leery of the dollar. To get to Dexton Min's point, twice over the past 6 months, we have, first from the US and then actually really more from Europe, a tremendous blow against the very idea, tremendous blows against the very idea of unified dollar or even euro systems have been struck. The United States stole Afghanistan's central bank reserves, fucking evil, insane imperial bullshit out of revenge, which basically made every country in the world go, wait a second, why do we keep our reserves on deposit with the United States if they can just steal it? Obviously, Afghanistan, Taliban control is a special case, but that's it. That chips away. And of course, the biggest surprise, maybe even bigger than the Ukrainian military, probably not, but almost as big a surprise for Russia as the force and power of the Ukrainian military, has been the fact that its massive foreign reserves that it built up, which were deposited more or less in Europe, were not, in fact, did not in fact make them sanction proof, because Europe decided it would attack those reserves as well. And sanction those reserves as well. So, yeah, I think that what Dexton Min is talking about there is that, yeah, there's a real threat to the international financial system and dollar primacy. 2 weeks in, 3 weeks in, a month in, 2 months in to this conflict, it doesn't appear to have had an effect. But what happens if the oil prices go crazy again? What happens if, which is almost certain to happen, what happens, 6 months, a year later, if we're still trying to do this? And Russia's still fighting and still isolated, and China's getting sick of this or this, that, and the other thing. Like, we've created a situation where the United States has the opportunity to move more towards peace, to solidify an extraordinary, like, it's an extraordinary second chance. It's almost like a second chance at the end of the Cold War. We have this opportunity to move forward and solidify that. Or we can get very pleased with ourselves and the fact that we've, got our, our white brothers or whatever in Europe back on side again, which is very significant economically, but less and less significant economically every year. So we can build on that coalition of Germany being on our side again, or we can just sit there with it, think that's good enough, and then watch the world spiral out of control as oil gets too expensive, as food gets too expensive, Or we could build on that coalition with Europe by bringing in all the other countries, which will, of course, make Russia more likely to lose quickly. But does the United States want Russia to lose quickly? Or do we want to continue to sell F-35s to our newly back on our side European power friends? That's an important question. So yeah, I think, Dexton, I think it's, I could see a real push to get off the dollar. I don't see it yet. But what's really important is sort of how the United States handles its outreach to Latin America, handles its outreach to Africa, handles its outreach to India in the coming months. So, yeah. There was a super chat. Did I miss one? Okay, now I got Kennard, got Star Pulse. Oh, there's two I've missed. Sorry. Star, no, where was that? Kennard. Fadel, the U.S. ambassador has condemned Wagner in Libya. Is that new though, Fadel? Fadel is always happy to bring our attention to the ongoing conflict in Libya. Of course, Haftar, the strongman we hate, is heavily supported by Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Russia. And the sort of Russian mercenaries are mostly paid for by the UAE that prop up Haftar vitally only in the east. He attempted to take over the whole country in 2019 and 2020, failed miserably, but still acts as a spoiler in the United Nations attempts to set up a functioning government in Libya. So, of course, the whole Russia-Ukraine thing destabilizes things. Unfortunately, Libya in recent months has found itself once again with two rival heads of state or heads of government. I'm not sure what the distinction on that is. But the U.S. ambassador has condemned Wagner in Libya. But I would have assumed that the U.S. ambassador had condemned Wagner in Libya long before that. Wagner, of course, is the name of the Russian mercenary company, sort of the Russian Blackwater. But that is an interesting data point, Funnel. Thank you. Staro Pulsaro, you often make the distinction between decisions made by Biden and his administration in your videos. Is this intentional or are they one in the same? No president has control over their administration. This was obviously has full control over their administration. This was obviously true to a ridiculous extent in the Trump administration, where nominally his personal diplomacy and political profile was super friendly to Russia, whereas his policy as an administration and certainly that the Congress put forward was as the most hostile towards Russia of any since Reagan, which of course led to this conflict. But yeah, 100%. A president is not in full control of his administration. This is especially true in foreign policy. I think Barack Obama's White House was famously very, very, very disciplined around domestic policy stuff. I'm not saying that they were famously really, really good at doing things. The Obamacare rollout was a famous flop and what have you. They at least tried to do things, which Trump never did in domestic policy, beyond executive orders. But the Obama administration was famously very disciplined on domestic policy, but in foreign policy, and Obama has essentially straight out said so in his famous exit interview with Jeffrey Goldberg of The Atlantic, essentially came out and said that, I was pushed into doing these things. The Libya intervention, which he characterizes as his greatest regret as president, makes sense to me. Robbing 10 years of economic growth from North Africa is a pretty fucked up thing to do. But he describes as how he was pressured into doing that. And Obama, I mean, this isn't even a critique. That to some degree, this is how systems should work. A political party, this idea of a president as a god king, as a personal, personal genius, what have you, is incorrect. It is not how a president should function. The personality, the character of a president is always important, but it should not be what determines what a country does. The Obama administration, he felt that it was necessary to hold on to power in his own party. He felt that it was necessary to bring in Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State, one of the worst Secretary of States in U.S. history. Led directly to the Libyan nightmare that she would brag and laugh about in television interviews. And the personnel she put in place, of course, led to the launch of the Ukraine crisis in 2013 and 2014. I believe she had bailed out to focus on her run for president by that point, having succeeded so amazingly in Libya. But so the point that I'm making is that Obama's instincts, and I do believe that Obama's instincts were, after he had been violent enough to satisfy the terrified American public around terrorism and whatnot, I think he was very interested in doing less abroad. But Hillary Clinton wanted big adventures that would, look good on the campaign trail. And of course, just yielded Benghazi, which is didn't look so great on the campaign trail. So what Clinton wanted, and importantly, what the military-industrial complex wanted, ended up being more important than what Obama wanted in many periods. By the second term of the Obama administration, he was smarter. He had more of a sense of how full of shit the generals were after the massive failure of the incredible overcommitment of the Afghanistan surge. We don't talk about this much, but yeah, I think the largest commitment of troops to Afghanistan we ever had, you can correct me on this, I might be wrong, was in Obama's first term because the military had convinced him that this would be a useful thing to do. We know, of course, it was a complete failure and just a way to spend money. And by his second term, Obama was able to do the Iran nuclear deal, kept us out of Syria, thank God. So yeah, presidents can get more powerful as they learn the job, but there's always a tension. And I would even argue there should be a tension between the president and his party, between the president and powerful figures in his cabinet, like Hillary Clinton, between the president and between the president, less, of course, of a fan of the tensions between the president and the military-industrial complex. With Biden specifically, I think twice now, we've seen really, really worthwhile leadership that can be personally attributed to Joe Biden. Nobody in the U.S. government wanted to end the Afghanistan gravy train except for Joe Biden. Well, I mean, Donald Trump, and would Joe Biden have been able to do that if Trump hadn't started the process? I don't think so. But Trump demonstrated over and over again that he was incapable of finishing the process of withdrawing from a country, while Biden actually was capable of finishing the process. That was tremendously good, and I think it's 100% true that Biden has provided really valuable restraint. It's really, I think doing a live chat 2 weeks ago, I would have laughed my ass off at the very idea of a no-fly zone and, quickly, the idea that we would try to do a no-fly zone, which is a no-fly zone is something that the U.S. can institute against a poor, weak country, the kinds of countries that are the only kinds of countries we choose to fight. If we were to attempt to institute a no-fly zone over Ukraine, that would mean we would have to shoot down Russian planes. That would mean that we would have to probably go after anti-air defense stuff in Belarus and Russia. A no-fly zone in Ukraine is World War III. And 2 weeks ago, I would have laughed at the very concept of doing a no-fly zone. Yet now we've seen U.S. media and now U.S. politicians and think tankers in Washington, D.C. pushing the idea of World War III with Russia. That's what a no-fly zone is. A no-fly zone is instant World War III. And this idea is being pushed. And thank God Joe Biden is there. Because Joe Biden has been explicit in almost every speech saying we are not going to war over Ukraine. We are not going to war over Ukraine. And thank God he's there. But yeah, I mean, I think I often talk about Biden personally being distinct from the decisions of his administration. Trump was operating in an entirely different world from the decisions of his administration. Obama often fought with other folks and often lost fights with other folks over the decisions of his administration. Bush famously, Cheney had a lot of power. And I was reading recently that actually by the end of Bush's time in power, Cheney was cut out, so that varies. And he was more relying on other folks. So yeah, I think I don't think any president is truly in control of their administrations. Questions. Oh, no super chat. Oh, that's a super chat. Joel's, do you have a question? Just a donation there. Questions. We were choke rushed in community. Oh, there's another. U.S. refused to upgrade Iraq's F-16 fleet. Wow. Fadel points out that the United States refused to upgrade Iraq's F-16 fleet during the ISIS fight, which is pretty amazing. Though I can see why, honestly. If there was a serious concern, as there was, in 2014 and 2015, there was a serious concern about whether or not the Iraqi government would fall, we didn't want to give more fresh equipment to Iraq. I'm entirely open to the idea that that was the wrong decision, and showed inadequate trust for Iraq, but I can see why that decision was made. But that is quite telling that the U.S. refused to upgrade the Iraqi military's F-16s when they were fighting for their lives against ISIS. It worked well, but I already answered a question from Dexton Min. Do we have questions from anybody else? Allowing democratic countries to join an alliance because they're terrified of an invasion. Is that choking Russia? 100%. 100%, Steve. Yeah, 100%. We chose this fight. We created this fight. We've worked 8 years to create this fight. Allowing Ukraine is not a democratic country. I mean, no, Ukraine's a democratic country. Like, it's dramatically less democratic than, say, Turkey. It's probably, I guess you could make a comparison, like Ukraine and Iran are similarly democratic countries. Probably, yeah. Because the amount of power that just sort of random oligarchs and militias have in Ukraine is, I think, comparable to the amount of power that the supreme leader has in Iran. It's important to point out that Ukraine, like the Ukrainian Prime Minister Zelensky, and this is actually a part of his appeal, and I think perhaps an unappreciated reason why he's been able to unite Ukraine to the extent that he was, is that he ran for power and won power to the U.S.'s chagrin on a platform of peace with Russia. He eventually had to turn more hawkish because he was afraid of a coup from more hawkish elements in Ukraine. He had to turn more hawkish to retain power. But yeah, like Ukraine is not like a happy, hunky-dory democracy. However, as I've been very clear about, the concerns about Ukraine's non-democracy, the concerns about the degree to which it's a U.S. puppet, the concerns about the degree to which it's been infiltrated by right-wing militias, all of those concerns stopped being important on February 24th or 23rd when Russia invaded. Who cares? It's like the Houthis. The Houthis are a really shitty group that control essentially the Yemeni government. They're really bad. They're anti-Semitic. They're nasty. But I don't care because they are an indigenous resistance group to foreign imperialist invasion. I don't care about all the crappy things about Ukraine because it is an indigenous resistance group against foreign invasion. And to be clear, I support that. But what I think needs to be appreciated, Steve, is the degree to which we created this situation. We 100% created this situation. And Russia, well, I mean, this is why Victoria Nuland might, in fact, be the best U.S. Bureaucrat of the 21st century. She created this situation under the Obama administration. She has, organized the new Ukrainian government, and she's running the Eastern Europe file now as I think the third or fourth most powerful person in the State Department back in the Biden administration. But I think it's really easy, Steve, to be like, oh, democracy's in peril. And you have to understand you're eating propaganda that has been created not just in terms of like the way news is spun, but we have to the extent that we created this situation. Now that this situation exists, now that Russia has idiotically fallen into this trap that we created for them, well, we have to keep stabbing them until they've suffered the full result of it. But we created this situation. As a more broader question, like of NATO, like people seem to think it's like some kind of get out of jail free question, or well, NATO isn't bad. People joined it voluntarily. Yes, of course. Of course, European countries joined NATO because they were terrified of Russia and didn't want to pay for their own defense. Of course. But it's very clear that European countries get an amazing deal out of NATO. What's the deal that the United States gets? The most important relationship for the survival of human civilization is the relationship between the United States and Russia. The policy of NATO expansion which is, all these little legitimately democratic governments that really love jeopardize the U.S.-Russian relationship, the most important relationship for the survival of human civilization. I am aware that Estonia and Hungary benefit from NATO. How does the U.S. benefit from NATO? And what did the U.S. lose by... I know how U.S. politicians and I know how the U.S. military-industrial complex benefits from NATO. That's very clear. How does the U.S. public benefit from NATO? How did the cause of peace on Earth and the continued survival of the human race benefit from NATO's destruction of the relationship between the only two countries, the United States and Russia, that can wipe out human civilization? So while I'm very clear that Russia is doing evil here, as just as clearly as the United States was doing evil in Iraq in 2003. That's very clear and must be opposed. I'm also we shouldn't allow that to erase the history of how this happened. Russia is the aggressor until the imperialist aggression of Russia has been crushed. I'm not particularly interested in questions of history or whatnot. But once Russia has been crushed, we need to ask a lot of really serious questions about how this situation arose. So yeah, Steve, sorry, that was my... Oh God, did Steve really say we should do a new no-fly zone? That makes me really angry. Star Pulsaro. So Steve wants World War III. I think I've made myself pretty clear to Steve. Sarah Pulsaro, I've started to notice a new conspiracy in mainstream media saying that China is backing Russia and allowed Russia to invade Ukraine and is financially backing them. Does this hold water? Unclear. I think it's unclear. I think that China is in a weird situation. I think the Chinese people know they're in a weird situation. So the Chinese government knows it's in a weird position. I think that China, as of February 20th, had a really unreserved interest and was very excited about Russia getting more and more isolated from the West, Russia giving more oil, selling more oil and gas resources directly to China, was very interested in Russia turning into a Chinese client state. I think what is unnerving to China right now is the speed with which Russia has become a Chinese client state and the extent to which it's a really bad deal. China, like everybody else, including Vladimir Putin, thought Russia had a much more impressive military, thought that Russia had a much better chance of exerting itself in Ukraine, thought that Russia had a lot more power as a spoiler in the West. China has found out to its great pain that, in fact, Russia is a weak military power that looks very unstable, that has now been entirely cut off from the West, making it a less useful satellite. There's a tension there. Like, obviously, China wants more of Russia's resources, but also Russia had more value as a place that, had these relationships with Germany or had these relationships with, it was Russia was a more valuable satellite to the extent that it was interweaved with Europe in ways that broke up NATO or made NATO less functional. Not all, but a lot of that has fallen away. Russia looks a lot weaker, and now Russia is basically, it's sort of like Russia looked like a much sexier, interesting partner that China very famously was making huge commitments to. I think it was in February or January or February of this year. No limits friendship, et cetera, et cetera. And Russia is now being like, hey, it's like Russia was like a beautiful woman that this is a terrible analogy. Wow, I need to not think that was really gross. Yeah, that's a really objectifying, nasty way. Like Russia was like a brand new beautiful sports car that was like, that China thought it bought, and now this brand new beautiful sports car has driven off a cliff and is limping around to China's front door. And doesn't run, doesn't have any of what it promised, and it's like, look, we're yours now. So that's that's China's problem right now. I think that I do think there's I think you're right, Sarah Pulsar, that there is a bit of unfairness in the way that some people are like, this is China, this was China's plan, this is what China's like, this is, we're in a world war now. Like that's a really insane thing that I see people saying, just sort of jumping like, oh, cool, like this is it. Like this isn't just a Cold War anymore. This is World War. And now we need to start sanctioning China. Like that shit's insane. But I do think there is a little bit of truth to I think it's quite possible that China knew this was going to happen. But I think China expected it to go much differently. So I think China's in a position where it has to start making some decisions. And I think making some really negative decisions about Russia, I think would be the very wise thing for it to do. So I think, Sarah Pulsar, I think it's an open question, the degree to which China is going to continue to support Russia. And I think the United States is maybe going a little too far, I think, at this point in pressuring U.S. Because pressuring China, most of the headlines we have in recent weeks have been talking about Russia asking about U.S. defense, U.S. intelligence community releases of Russia's apparently asking China for military support. China is providing some military support. It's important to recognize that China hasn't committed to any sanctions. So what is support? Is China selling stuff to Russia support all of a sudden? But that's a bit strange because Europe is funneling tons of money to Russia right now. So I think it can be a little unfair, our interpretations of what China is doing to support Russia at this moment. However, I do think you can make a case that China probably knew that Russia was going to do this. It did not know that it was going to be such an extraordinary failure. So yeah, I think China needs to do some recalculation, or else all those people who are chomping at the bit for a new massive, Cold War against the Russia-China bloc, the stupid people, as far as I'm concerned. But those people are going to have a much better case if a month or two from now, Russia's still fighting this out and is fighting it out with obvious, significant material support from China. Fadal asks, the U.S. is pulling out of MENA will for sure have long-term consequences for the Gulf monarchies in Israel. Is the U.S. willing to risk these consequences? I don't see any real long-term consequences for Israel if the U.S. pulls out of MENA. Pulling out of MENA would mean supporting Israel what I mean by pulling out of MENA is just pulling our 60,000 troops out of all those countries and saying bye-bye. In the greatest, arguably the greatest sort of existential risk that Israel ever experienced in 1973 or 72 or 73, was it? The Yom Kippur, well, the Israelis call it the Yom Kippur War. I'm sure everyone else in the Middle East has a different name for it. Israel was in incredible danger and was saved by the United States, and the United States had no military presence in the Middle East at that point. As far as the U.S.'s interest in the continued existence and flourishing of Israel, our presence isn't useful. I would argue, in fact, our presence makes things worse. The only serious threat, and I don't consider it a particularly serious threat, I consider it a decent balancer against Israel at this point, is Hezbollah. Hezbollah was produced by the Lebanese Civil War. The United States military presence in Israel has produced Lebanon Civil War type circumstances across Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and Libya over the past 20 years. That is not, these are ideal Hezbollah production circumstances. U.S. presence in the Middle East has not helped Israel, and Israel will not be in any kind of jeopardy if the U.S. Is providing its support from Germany or from, and Germany will always be down to defend Israel, or always be down to allow the United States to defend Israel from German territory. Yeah, there's no, how is the U.S. Any less equipped to defend Israel from Germany or from Cyprus or from aircraft carriers? That not in any way is the answer to that question. The consequences for the Gulf monarchies of the U.S. pulling out of MENA will probably be the U.S. Gulf monarchies making peace with Iran. We saw already in 2019 how the Houthi Iranian bombing of the Abqaiq oil refinery that knocked off something like 50% of Saudi Arabia's oil production capacity for a couple days. Iran, well, nominally the Houthis, but Iran did this in 2019. The United States did nothing. And since then, Saudi Arabia has been a lot more committed to peace with Iran. So I think getting U.S. physical troops out of the Middle East would lead to peace, basically. Peace everywhere. Yeah, this is pretty much what the result would be. The U.S. mostly just acts as a spoiler and a creator of destruction in the Middle East right now. We can very capably defend defend Israel from from further afield, and the Gulf monarchies aren't, in my opinion, worth defending. Jules, is it better for China for the Ukrainian war to end as soon as possible, since the longer it goes on, the more unified the West is, or is more leverage over Russia better? That's a really interesting question, Jules, because there's a lot of dynamics to that. I think assuming that it's better for China for the war to end as soon as possible assumes that like the peak of Western resolve and fellow feeling and almost euphoria that we're experiencing right now is going to continue. And I don't think that's true. I mean, I think Europe and the United States, well, I mean, who knows? In the United States, I mean, if this goes on for the rest of the year and oil prices get to, $6 to $7 to $8 to $9 to $10 a gallon, sorry, the gas prices at the pump are $10 a gallon in the United States, 6 months from now, well, maybe the U.S. gets less interested in this. Maybe, there's all kinds of things that can possibly get better. I think that Russia's best hope at this point is to hold on to what he has in the hopes that the effects on the rest of the world become so damaging that the rest of the world bands up against Europe and the United States and demands an end to the situation, demands an accommodation with Russia. That's Putin's best hope at this point, is that he can still, maybe he's still got more military oomph than most people think at this point. But I think his best hope at this point is to drag it out to the point that India gets pissed off, that Africa gets pissed off, that Egypt can't feed itself, that U.S. consumers start dealing with, continue to deal with overpriced oil prices for longer than they're interested in. So I don't know how China, but for China, actually, Jules, I think you're right. For China, it's a different calculation. China, is tremendously dependent on oil and gas, more than the United States is, I think, in real terms and also just in terms of significance for their economy. I read a really interesting thing a couple weeks back talking about how in the developed world, in the United States, our insanely high per capita usage of oil and gas. Actually, I think our actual consumption of oil and gas is still higher than China's, because we are so heavy in our usage of it per capita. But it's actually much more flexible. We actually can make decisions much more quickly about, I guess I'm not going to take that trip to Grandma's. Maybe I'll take the bus instead. Maybe I won't fly down to the Caribbean or whatever. We can actually make those decisions because we're richer, frankly. Whereas for China, the business that this middle-class striving person, has founded requires using this amount of oil and gas. So yeah, it's really bruising. The current oil and gas prices, even though they've fallen, are really bruising for China. And so yeah, I think for China, yeah, I don't think actually the second part of your sentence is true. I don't think that The West is going to get more unified the longer this goes on. I think Putin's best hope is to drag this out longer and longer. But China is still very, very sensitive to oil and gas prices, and would like this to end sooner. And as I said, yeah, like, Russia was a very, very hot sports car that China thought it bought in recent months that, drove off a cliff. I think leverage over Russia is now guaranteed, regardless. It's now, I think talking about it as a China-Russia bloc actually makes a lot more sense. And I think, of course, for Russia, that means that China is going to start asserting more power over it in ways that Russia's not going to like. And then maybe it'll fall apart. But yeah, I think that China's already been given all the leverage over Russia it could ever want, more than it wanted, in fact. So yeah. Oh wow. Okay, Brando Commando, we've got a lot going on here. Thoughts on Shinzo Abe saying that the U.S. should end strategic ambiguity towards Taiwan. Abe spent most of his political capital trying to rescind Japan's pacifist amendment, but failed to do so entirely. Is Taiwan more vulnerable now than ever? I think Taiwan is less vulnerable than ever, and I didn't think Taiwan was particularly vulnerable before. There was a really interesting news story that I was just thinking to myself I should have dived into more. I don't know if you recall, I guess probably about a year ago now, I ran a video saying that, like, what Taiwan desperately needs to do is work more on defending itself, because the U.S. wants to sell it generally useless shit like fighter jets and tanks. Well, I guess looks more useful in Ukraine. Tanks look more useful in Ukraine, or actually, do they? They're getting picked off one by one. I'd said in a video I ran about a year ago about how Taiwan desperately needed to step up its own missile manufacturing capacity and mass produce missiles on Taiwan. It's got the capability to do so. Where we've all heard so much about Taiwan's high-end microchip fabrication, and all a missile is a microchip attached to a tube full of explosives. In recently publicized news, Taiwan is doing exactly that. They are mass producing missiles. As badly humiliating as the Russian attempt to take Ukraine has been, I assure you, troop carriers filled with Chinese soldiers getting sunk to the bottom of the Taiwan Strait in their thousands would be much more humiliating. I'm not saying that's guaranteed to happen. I think there's a real risk that because Russia has proven to be such a fraction of as threatening as we all assumed they were, despite the fact that Russia has proven to be a paper tiger, that does not mean, to some extent, Russia has proven to be a paper tiger. That does not mean that China will. China is a country on the way up. China, one of the things that have made Russia's military experience so crappy and so sad to look at is the fact that they're using a lot of ancient Soviet equipment. All of China's equipment has been built in the past 10, 15 years. Whereas Russia's getting humiliated with 50-year-old equipment. China has 15-year-old equipment, max. That's the oldest. I mean, that's not true. I'm sure they've got some older stuff too. But in terms of the equipment that they would be using against Taiwan, it would be very modern. And it would also be tens of thousands of mass-produced missiles at a scale that we can't even comprehend. So I don't think it makes sense to go to the extreme of saying, "Oh, I bet China's just as much of is just as small a threat as Russia turned out to be." I wouldn't say that at all, but I do think that the Chinese are looking much more closely at just how much of a failure this has been for Russia, both on the how it's proven to be more of a challenge for Russia. It's taken longer than expected. It has resulted in a high degree of international opprobrium and sanctioning or what have you. Of course, again, That's in the short term. In the short term, Russia's attempt to take Ukraine looks like a colossal failure. But if Russia does manage to hang on, does manage to get a few of the things that they wanted, or potentially, this wears on for 6 months or a year, maybe there's a bigger fracture between members of the West or the West and other countries. So yeah, I think that what's the word I'm looking for here? I think the jury's still out on what the final result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine will be. But I do think there's a lot of these initial weeks that are very sobering for folks in China who were thinking, oh, let's go invade Taiwan. So that, combined with the sobering effect on the Chinese leadership, combined with the fact that I don't know if this is actually something that came up in the past 2 or 3 weeks, but it's certainly something that's become more popularized in the past 2 or 3 weeks. The Taiwanese are now mass producing the missiles they need to defend themselves. I feel like Taiwan is probably more secure. Shinzo Abe is a very interesting figure. I think that's a very interesting thing to bring up. I think that probably, I talk a lot about how the United States has antagonized China in recent years. Probably the most important thing that we did to antagonize China was to work with Shinzo Abe to attempt to break down Japanese pacifism. That's probably the most threatening thing that we have participated in vis-a-vis China over the past decade. Far more threatening, I would say I think it's more insulting, Trump's activities over Taiwan, now Biden's activities over Taiwan are more insulting and inflammatory, but in terms of being truly threatening, I would say that Obama's attempts to work with Shinzo Abe to do away with Japan's pacifist commitment, probably the most legitimately threatening thing that we've done to China over the past decade. I do not think Taiwan is more vulnerable now than ever. I think that China is probably going to have a push over the next 2 to 5 years, trying to figure out. I gotta hope that they're going to sort of abandon this wolf warrior thing, look for ways to rebuild connections with Taiwan, yada yada. But I don't think the prospects of a Chinese attempt to physically invade Taiwan, in the 2030s have fallen at all. But I don't think they've gone any higher in the 2020s, and have probably gone a bit lower in the near term, before 2025. Star Pulsaro asks, will the Russia-Ukraine war accelerate integration of the remaining Western Balkan states into the EU and NATO? God, I hope so, Star Pulsaro. God, I hope so. And I gotta think so. I think that, not that I've seen anything that indicates this, Star Pulsaro, but the ridiculousness of allowing Ukraine into the EU. This is apparently something that's happening. The EU has greenlit, I think Zelensky put on a suit for the first time in, or did he? I don't know. Maybe I'm thinking of that clip from his TV show, but I think that Zelensky put on a suit for the first time for the only time of the past 3 weeks, to sign a document applying for EU membership. That document has been supercharged or facilitated or what's put on a faster track. What that actually means, I don't know. But certainly more EU money, more EU closeness, more EU stuff for Ukraine is an inevitability over the next year, provided Ukraine survives, which now seems very likely. So the idea of allowing Ukraine in without giving something to Serbia, Kosovo, was it Montenegro, and Bosnia? Are those and Macedonia? Sorry, North Macedonia. It seems incomprehensible to me. But hey, the EU is often incomprehensible to me. I would think, Sir, I haven't seen much indication that it is happening, but I would think that we're going to get more serious movement on EU stuff for the remaining Balkan states. I would hope and expect. We've only got 10 minutes left. Why don't I think I'll take was there a super chat that I missed? I think I'm good on the super chats here. I'm going to answer a TikTok question. If China does invade, it would be with the plan, I will wait until Taiwan will join. Taiwan will not join NATO. Do you ever get the Jack Black comparison? I can't get it out of my head. Usually when I get the Jack Black comparison, it's a sign that it's time for me to diet. It's usually when I'm doing really well, I get the Chris Pratt comparison, but that's it's been a couple of years. So yeah, clearly I need to get in better shape. Yeah, I don't enjoy the Jack Black comparison much, but it's kind of tubby. He's a funny guy. It's kind of tubby. Let's see. If Russia nuked a NATO country, will the U.S. nuke Russia? Absolutely. NATO looks fake to me. Will U.S. sacrifice revenge others? Absolutely. Yeah, we will. See, because as I explained earlier in this presentation, there's nothing that's more important to the United States government than selling weapons. Not because selling weapons is that important to the U.S. economy. It's just a endless source of corruption in the U.S. government, both for generals, for not diplomats, but for generals, for members of multiple agencies, and for Congress people specifically. The arms industry, there's all kinds of rules about how Congress people and government people are supposed to be able to interact with business people. All of those go out of the window around the arms industry. They're encouraged to be as corrupt as possible about the arms industry because, of course, they are the main audience. They are the main consumers of the arms industry. So the arms industry is incredibly important for U.S. government. It's an endless font of corruption for them. Not legally defined corruption, but 100% corruption. So nothing matters more to the U.S. government than arms sales. And NATO is the single biggest source of arms sales. Of course, it's really important Saudi Arabia, UAE. That's why they have so much power, is because of the amount of weapons that they purchase. But there's 27 countries in the EU, and every single one of them is a potential ongoing multi-billion-dollar F-35 contract and potential contracts for everything else. And obviously, Ukraine is proving to go through a tremendous amount of munitions. So yeah. And when Saudi Arabia and the UAE aren't actively trying to destroy Yemen as they are, they're not as much of a demand for weapons. So it's tremendously important for the United States to continue to be able to sell weapons to NATO. So yeah, if it's not a question if Putin nukes Estonia, if Putin attempts to invade Estonia, we're at war with Russia, and that is something that could very quickly lead to nuclear war. So yeah. Brando Commando, any hope for Turkish-Greek relations, or is it a fever dream with everything going on in Cyprus and the Aegean? I honestly, Brando Commando, before this morning, I would have been like, yeah, I don't think it's going to work, but on Sunday or Monday, yeah, on Sunday, this past Sunday, the Greek prime minister went to Turkey to meet with Erdogan. There's photographs of the Greek prime minister and Erdogan, and of course they're like, oh, well, we have many disputes, but it's important, in the current situation to focus more on political objectives. So yeah, we're already seeing. In my research this morning, that was what was most surprising to me, because I had intended my presentation to be like more cautionary. Well, Turkey's not going to get anywhere until they give up that S-400, and I think Turkey's already gotten somewhere with Europe. It's true, there's no intimation of long-term settlement of Turkish or Greek issues, or even German Turkish issues. But the fact that the Prime Minister of Greece, the Chancellor of Germany, are willing to go to Turkey and meet with Erdogan, I mean, that's a tremendous step forward. And every set of Turkish every Turkish functionary or advisor now has phone numbers for people who talk directly to the leaders of Greece and Germany. A tremendous step forward for Turkish diplomacy with everyone in Europe. That's already happening. That's already happening. I was legitimately surprised when I just looked into it this morning how much progress Turkey has already made with their relations to Europe. With the United States, the S-400 remains a tremendous stumbling block But yeah, it's surprising how fast that's moving. Okay, I think. Oh, nope, there's another one. Another super chat. I believe a future coalition of countries will invade Israel at some point, whether it'll be an Arab superstate or something else. Well, at some point, Fado? Yeah, I mean, probably. I mean, at some point, but at what point? At what point? I think is a really key question. Like, are we talking the 2400s? Are we talking the 2300s? Are we talking the 2200s? Yeah, I could believe that. I don't think I see it in the 2000s or the 2100s, honestly. But I mean, who knows? Like, I mean, as we get further and further in the future, like I don't see a serious attempt to invade Israel until the U.S. empire falls. So, and I don't really see the U.S. empire falling in my lifetime at any point. At this point, it's possible within 50 years, huh? Yeah, I don't see it. I just don't see it. I mean, the U.S. would have to really fuck up, and that U.S. fucking up would have to somehow. Because I think Israel's already made the relationships it needs to try and survive the fall of the United States. Relationships with India, China, and I don't really see the fall of the United States world power in evidence in the short term or even the medium term anymore. So yeah, I just don't. Within 70 years, maybe. Yeah, I mean, in 70 years, a lot can change. The U.S., has a lot of, by the end of this century, could somebody attempt to invade Israel again? Maybe. But like, I just don't, it's so distant from the current array of forces that I just don't see it as a real prospect. Yeah. Off topic, but is the new scramble for Africa a real thing? Will the U.S. and China battle for economic supremacy on the continent? A battle for economic supremacy on the continent between China and France and the United States sounds great for Africa. And I think that we should uncritically celebrate that, frankly. I think China, for very different reasons, a lot of Chinese aid to Europe has proved to be somewhat, sorry, to Africa has proved to be somewhat disappointing, as it has, as has a half century's worth of European and U.S. aid to Africa has proven to be very disappointing for different reasons with China. But what we're seeing is we're seeing different approaches. A lot of the propaganda around debt trap diplomacy is frankly bullshit. Maybe you could see a real problem for countries that default on Chinese debt, but that's not going to be a problem again until the end of the U.S. empire. China's military or navy has become a very big issue within 100 miles of China's coastline. It is not a serious issue. I think they've got a base in Djibouti, but that is nowhere near enough to actually intimidate some of these countries that have defaulted on things. Just simply not enough power. I think you'll find, as we have seen already, what was it, the Entebbe, there was a Uganda default, and everyone's like, oh, like China's going to take over the Entebbe airport. And no, China renegotiated its debt with the Ugandan government or what have you. So yeah, like I think there's a lot of, I think 50 years from now, or maybe 20 years from now, if the U.S. really screws up, it's very possible, you could see a situation where China does have that kind of military power. And is, intimidating real clients in Africa. That's a possibility. But like the idea of like China, like doing quasi peacekeeping missions, like in the Wolf Warrior films, or attempting to sort of like physically intimidate African countries, we're nowhere near there. And the fact that they're providing money to build roads and trains and stuff, some of the roads and trains are not useful. There are huge issues around, the Chinese not actually wanting to transfer any technology or know-how just importing their own workers or whatever. Those are all very legitimate, but the idea that like China is threatening Africa or threatening the U.S. and Africa is not particularly credible. I think you could construct a case. I don't think it'd be a particularly credible one, but I think you could construct a case. I think China, you could construct a case that France is threatened by China. And I think that'd be a good thing because France's empire in Africa is pretty nasty. Morari says, keep telling China is not committing genocide. See you next time. I don't think China's committing genocide. I think China's committing cultural genocide. I think China is absolutely doing to the Uyghurs similar things to what the United States did to Native Americans throughout the 19th and 20th century. I think calling it like actual genocide cheapens the word genocide. But that's just me. Let's see. Any questions? No super chats? Okay, then I think it's time to start. I think it is time to start spieling. My name is Robert Morris. I do something every Tuesday here on YouTube at Mo Freedom Foundation or on TikTok at More Freedom Foundation. Sometimes it is a live chat like it is today. Often it's a produced video. Sometimes it's an unproduced video. YouTube now requires longer and more. Now requires 15-minute videos to get people to watch them. So I'm averaging like 2 a month. I hope to make that higher average, but that's how the way the cookie crumbles. I've got daily shorts if you're interested on YouTube now. Most of this content ends up repurposed on TikTok as well. If you're more interested in following me there, you can follow me on Instagram at More Freedom Foundation, TikTok at More Freedom Foundation. YouTube is Mo Freedom Foundation without the RE because of character limits. And you can follow me on Twitter at RoboLaw. That's probably one of the best places to reach me, on Twitter at RoboLaw. It's always have a fun time on there. This channel only exists because of patrons and super chats, of course. It's folks who support me on Patreon. I've got Patreon available in the link tree on TikTok and on my what's the word I'm looking for? And on the homepage on YouTube. You can support me on Patreon or PayPal. If you sign up on Patreon, I've been doing more live chats recently, but usually I only do one monthly live chat and one monthly live chat for the public and one monthly live chat for the patrons only. During the patrons only newscast, I attempt to cover everything that the patrons tell me to cover. So I do like 20 minutes of research on a wide array of things that patrons ask me to do. I think it's a lot of fun. It's really educational for me. And that's only available to the patrons. I guess we just had it on Saturday. It's usually the first Saturday of the month. Sometimes it's the second Saturday of the month, depending on my personal schedule. We also have a Discord server for the patrons. The Discord is only available to the patrons. You got to sign up on Patreon to have access to the Discord server. It's a lot of fun. I didn't know what it was, but now it's just this rolling geopolitical discussion. We've got different channels on different areas. I occasionally jump in, but it's mostly just smart people from all over the world talking seriously about geopolitical issues. It's pretty great. And yes, we have the patrons only live chat on YouTube, and then we also have a patrons only Discord chat once a month, which is more of a Zoom call. I don't prepare anything. We just it's usually about 8 or 9 folks from all over the world. We sort of jump on, just discuss things. It's a great opportunity to see the faces and hear the voices of the folks who make this channel possible. So I really enjoy that. So yeah, Patreon, highly recommend it. That'd be great. I've also written a couple books. Avoiding the British Empire is sort of my great summing up of how the world became what it is today, how the United States is a lot more similar to the British Empire than we acknowledge, and something else. a lot more similar to the British Empire than we typically acknowledge, and how the U.S. Empire is making a lot of the same decisions that the British Empire made that led to the destruction of their world system in two apocalyptic world wars. And also, I wrote Everybody's Lying About Islam a number of years ago, talks about the U.S.-Saudi relationship that was at the root of all that terrorism stuff that we used to care about so much. Okay, cool. Oh, Bobo asks, what is the end game for Putin? I don't know, man. A lot of people think that, have questions around whether he is, a lot of people think that his regime is going to collapse. But I think a lot of people are also saying, who knows? He could be there for another 2 days. He could be there for another 20 years. So I think it's too early to ask what the end game of Putin is. I think probably his best bet right now, as I said earlier, is to try to drag this out to the point where there's enough world suffering to get angry at U.S. and European efforts to crush Putin and make them more likely to pressure Ukraine into some sort of settlement. U.S. and Putin are brothers. They never attack each other. That's not true. In fact, we are slaughtering Russian soldiers through Ukrainian proxies right now, and we actually killed a whole bunch of Russians in Syria, though neither country wants to talk about that. Logical Extreme, this will be the last question. Does Russia's military failure incentivize China more likely to antagonize India and Vietnam since they use Russian weapons? Oh, that's an interesting question. I would say probably not. But you are right in that I bet that makes India and Vietnam more interested in U.S. weapons. Anyway, we've been doing this for 2 hours and 10 minutes. Unless there are more super chats, I think I'm going to end this. Thank you all so much for being here. This has been awesome. It's a completely new world. I'm trying to figure out what's going on, what the world order looks like since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I think everybody else is too. It's quite an unsettled time, and I'm grateful to all of you for showing up to help me try and figure out what's going on. This has been great, and I am ending the stream.